Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we really try to cut through all the noise and get to what's actually going on. Today, we're diving deep into one of the biggest legal stories lately. I mean, a case that's just stirred up so much confusion, anger, debate, everything. We're talking, of course, about the federal trial of Sean Diddy Combs and the verdict. Wow, it just landed. Incredibly explosive, really mixed, and honestly, it's left a lot of us just kind of scratching our heads. Okay, so let's unpack this. This isn't just, another celebrity headline that pops up and then vanishes.
Well, it's essential we dig into the details of this legal outcome because, frankly, a lot of people are asking, how does that even make sense?
Yeah.
You've probably seen the headlines, heard the buzz, maybe felt a bit confused yourself. So our mission today, go beyond those first reactions. We want to guide you through what exactly happened, why these specific legal points matter so much, and importantly, what happens next. And we're basing all this on the sources we've really dug into. We know it's complex, we see the wildly different reactions out there, and we're here to hopefully help you make sense of it.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating here, I think, is just how unusual a mixed verdict like this actually is. Especially, in a case this high profile, with these kinds of charges against someone like Diddy, it immediately tells us we need to dissect some really crucial legal distinctions. Things that, honestly, most people, even if they follow the news closely, might just not be aware of. So instead of just broad statements or emotional takes, it's so important we zoom right in. Look at the specific charges, the evidence that was actually presented, and how the jury got to these very particular decisions. That's where the real story is. And believe me, it's way more complicated than the headlines let on.
Absolutely. And just to recap for anyone who maybe only caught bits and pieces, the big news is Sean Diddy Combs walked away from that federal trial with a mixed verdict. So it wasn't a total win for the prosecution, but it definitely wasn't a full acquittal either. Let's start with what he was not found guilty of, because these were the really heavy ones, right? The charges that dominated the conversation and carried the most serious potential jail time. The jury found Combs not guilty of racketeering conspiracy. And crucially, both counts of sex trafficking. One involving Cassie Ventura, the other involving a woman known just as Jane. So what that means, based on the jury's decision, is that the prosecution couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he ran some kind of organized criminal operation, or that he specifically coerced sexual victims. For a lot of people, that was a huge development right there, especially given how serious the initial allegations were. But, and here's where it gets really interesting, where the confusion really started to set in for a lot of folks. Despite those not guilty verdicts on the big charges, he was found guilty on 2 lesser counts, specifically for transporting women for prostitution under something called the Mann Act. One count related to Cassie Ventura and another for the woman known as Jane. And this is the part that made so many people just pause and go, wait, hang on. Not guilty of sex trafficking, but guilty of transporting for prostitution. How? How does that work?
And that question, it perfectly nails the core difference between the public's gut feeling and the precise legal reality that unfolded in court. So let's break down those not guilty verdicts first, just to really get the significance. Racketeering conspiracy. I mean, in basic terms, it's an incredibly complex charge, really hard to prove. Prosecutors essentially have to show there's this long-term organized criminal enterprise going on, proving someone is running a criminal organization, almost like a mob boss, leading a whole network. Now, the prosecution here, and a lot of legal experts watching the trial pointed this out, they might have, let's say, overreached a bit by trying to paint Diddy in that light, trying to prove this vast, coordinated scheme. The standard for proving that kind of charge is just incredibly high. You need tons of evidence showing a structure, ongoing crime, and clear intent by the defendant to run that enterprise. So the jury's saying not guilty there. It suggests they just weren't convinced the evidence met that really demanding standard. They didn't see that orchestrated criminal enterprise. And similarly, sex trafficking.
Yeah.
That's another very serious, very emotionally loaded offense, obviously. Legal and speaking, it usually involves proving things like coercion, fraud, or force were used to make someone engage in commercial sex acts. It's fundamentally about proving there wasn't real consent or that vulnerability was exploited to force someone into something they didn't freely choose, often as part of a bigger operation. The fact the jury found him not guilty on both counts for both women tells us the prosecution, even with compelling testimony, didn't manage to prove those specific elements, coercion, fraud, systemic, forced exploitation, to the jury's satisfaction. The evidence required. It's really stringent. You often need clear proof of force, threats, manipulation, or a definite pattern of control that overrides someone's free will. So when experts say the prosecution overreached by going for the mob boss angle, it suggests their strategy might have been too ambitious. Maybe they focused on a big narrative of power and control that, while maybe compelling in some way, just didn't have the precise legal proof needed for those specific, very tough charges. They might have aimed for a bigger splash. A conviction that the evidence, strictly under the law for those offenses, just couldn't quite support.
Okay, so if they couldn't nail down the whole mob boss thing or the direct coercion needed for sex trafficking, how did they actually get those guilty verdicts on the Mann Act charges? This is really where the nuance kicks in, and it's what tripped up so many people.
Exactly. And this is the key distinction that gets right to that social media question. Not guilty of sex trafficking, but guilty of transporting for prostitution. How? So the Mann Act, it's actually an old law, officially the White Slave Traffic Act from way back in 1910. It's evolved, but it basically targets transporting people across state lines or internationally for immoral purposes. And that definitely includes prostitution. Now, the key difference here is the legal threshold, what the prosecution has to prove. Unlike sex trafficking, which, as we said, needs proof of coercion, fraud, or forced compelling someone against their will, the Mann Act, in this context, focuses more narrowly on the act of transporting someone across state lines with the specific intent that they engage in prostitution. It doesn't necessarily require proof that the person being transported was forced or unwilling, though that can make things worse if it's there. The Mann Act conviction hinges on the transportation itself and the clear purpose behind it. It's less about the bigger picture of an orchestrated criminal enterprise or the systemic forced exploitation you need for racketeering or the higher bar of sex trafficking. So what the jury might have found is enough evidence that Diddy arranged or helped with the travel Cassie Ventura's and Jane's travel across state lines and did so with the specific understanding or purpose that they would engage in prostitution. But crucially, they might not have concluded these women were forced or trafficked in the legal sense required for a sex trafficking conviction. For example, prosecutors might have shown flight records, hotel bookings, maybe text messages, or testimony outlining travel plans clearly linked to a purpose involving commercial sex. That kind of evidence, even if it doesn't explicitly show coercion, could be enough for the Mann Act. But that same evidence might not meet the higher standard needed to prove a pattern of coercive control or force for the sex trafficking charges. It's a very fine legal line, I know, and the justice system draws these distinctions carefully, even if it seems like splitting hairs to us, on the outside. The public often just lumps any involvement in commercial sex under the umbrella of trafficking, but the law is super specific. Different definitions, different evidence needed for each. And prosecutors have to prove every single element of the specific charge beyond a reasonable doubt. Here, the jury felt the elements for the Mann Act were met, but not for the more severe sex trafficking or racketeering charges.
Right, so it boils down less to the force or control and more to the logistics, the moving across state lines, combined with the clear intent for that specific purpose. Okay, that does clear up a lot of that initial, reaction. So what are the actual consequences Diddy is facing now for these convictions, the Mann Act ones?
Well, they're still significant. The Mann Act convictions carry a potential penalty of up to 10 years in federal prison for each count, so potentially 20 years. However, and this is really crucial for listeners to understand, the maximum sentence is almost never what gets handed down, especially for nonviolent offenses or cases where the defendant doesn't have a long prior criminal record. Legal experts who followed the case closely, they're currently expecting a sentence in a much narrower range, probably somewhere between, say, 15 and 21 months in total for both counts combined.
So significantly less than the max.
Right. And that expectation comes from the federal sentencing guidelines. These are complex formulas that factor in all sorts of things like the exact nature of the offense, the defendant's criminal history, any factors that make it worse, like being a leader in the offense, or factors that might lessen it, like cooperation or accepting responsibility, though that doesn't seem to be the case here.
Okay.
The judge has some wiggle room within those guidelines, but the calculated range gives a pretty strong idea of what's typical for similar convictions. So things like the lack of physical violence alleged in these specific counts, the defendant's role, the lack of a lengthy criminal history, those can all push the guideline range down. So while it's definitely not the kind of life-altering sentence that racketeering or sex trafficking could have brought, those could have been decades, maybe even life over a year in federal prison, that's still very real. A substantial outcome. It's not just a slap on the wrist. It's a significant chunk of time behind bars and a serious consequence that will definitely impact his life and career going forward.
And then there's that other piece. the major conspiracy charge, where the jury just couldn't agree. The hung jury. What does that mean, practically speaking? For Diddy, for the case, does that charge just vanish?
No, absolutely not. It doesn't just disappear. A hung jury means exactly what it sounds like. The jurors couldn't reach a unanimous decision on that specific charge. In federal court, you need all jurors to agree guilty or not guilty for a verdict. If they can't get there, that particular charge just, well, it remains unresolved. It's like that part of the trial didn't reach a definitive end. So the immediate result, no official verdict on that count. He wasn't convicted, but he wasn't acquitted either on that specific charge.
Okay, so it's just hanging there.
Exactly. And that's a really significant part of this whole unfolding story because it leaves a critical door wide open. The prosecutors still have the option to pursue a retrial just on that one racketeering conspiracy count. Now, it's not guaranteed they will. They'll have to weigh a lot of factors. But the possibility itself just hangs over Diddy, extending the legal uncertainty and his potential future risk. A hung jury doesn't mean innocence. It just means the prosecution didn't convince all 12 jurors beyond a reasonable doubt in that specific trial. Some jurors probably did think he was guilty, just not all of them.
Yeah, this verdict definitely didn't settle things down. It set off an immediate, really explosive reaction everywhere. Media, social media, legal analysts. We heard a lot of legal experts saying pretty quickly that the prosecutors overreached, especially with that whole mob boss angle. What does that idea, that concept of overreach, actually mean for how the public sees justice in these big, flashy cases?
It's a really critical point, and it gets to the heart of these high-stakes legal fights. When experts talk about overreach, they're suggesting the prosecution's strategy, maybe the charges they brought, were perhaps too ambitious, maybe too sensational, or maybe designed more to create a certain public story than what the actual evidence could strongly support under those strict legal definitions we talked about. In Diddy's case, that mob boss comparison, it suggests they tried to paint this picture of a huge, coordinated criminal operation, maybe trying to tap into public perception or anger against a celebrity, but they just couldn't meet that incredibly high evidence bar for racketeering or sex trafficking convictions. And this overreach idea, it can definitely feed into a public feeling that the legal system is maybe flawed or that it's more about big stories and PR than hard legal proof. It can also fuel that cynical view, the idea that if prosecutors can't win on their biggest, most headline-grabbing charges, maybe their whole case was weak, or maybe justice gets bent somehow when the defendant has power or money. This narrative also reflects back on the prosecution, too. Did they spend too much time, too many resources, chasing charges they couldn't ultimately prove? It raises questions about their strategy. Were they influenced by the intense spotlight on someone like Diddy? It's always a tricky balance for prosecutors. Pursue justice aggressively, but don't look like you're just driven by the headlines.
And you saw that exact confusion play out perfectly online. That quote, Diddy was found not guilty of sex trafficking, but somehow guilty of transporting someone for prostitution. How does that even work? I mean, that just captures the public's immediate, gut reaction. Can you maybe elaborate just a bit more on why that distinction is so important, even if it feels, totally counterintuitive to most people?
Absolutely. That comment, it's the perfect example of the gap between how we normally think about these things and how the law actually works with its very precise language. We touched on the definitions earlier, but it's worth hitting again with that specific question in mind because, it shows a real public misunderstanding. Sex trafficking under federal law, like we said, usually needs proof of force, fraud, or coercion, using those things to make someone engage in commercial sex. It's about involuntary servitude, exploitation through compulsion. That element of no consent or being forced is key. The Mann Act, though, in this context, it specifically punishes the act of transporting someone across state lines for the purpose of prostitution. It doesn't necessarily hinge on whether that person was coerced or unwilling. So, just to be crystal clear, the jury might have believed, based on the evidence, that Diddy helped these women travel with the specific intent for them to engage in prostitution. But they didn't find enough proof that he used force, fraud, or coercion to compel them against their will. This is where our everyday understanding of trafficking, which almost always implies force and lack of consent, bumps right up against the specific legal definition and what needs to be proven for that particular conviction.
Right.
Maybe the evidence showed clear texts about travel plans for prostitution or money changing hands for that travel. That satisfies the Mann Act elements. But that same evidence might not have been enough to prove the higher standard of systematic coercive control or force needed for the sex trafficking charge. It's a super fine line, often down to specific wording in a law or whether one single piece of evidence is there or not. The law demands every single element of a charge be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And for sex trafficking, those elements of force, fraud, or coercion. The jury decided they weren't proven to that standard. But the elements for transporting with intent under the Mann Act, they felt those were met.
Then you get the other side of the coin, that other really blunt social media take, which is also pretty powerful. This Diddy trial is proof that you can do anything if you got money. I mean, that statement, just raw like that, it really brings up that deep question about how wealth is perceived to influence court outcomes, especially in these huge celebrity cases.
Yeah, this raises a really important and honestly deeply uncomfortable question about public trust in the whole justice system. Now, obviously, we can't say whether that statement is true or not, but the perception itself, it's incredibly widespread, especially when a famous, wealthy person faces serious charges and then avoids the worst possible convictions. It can really feed into people's existing anxieties about inequality, about whether the system truly treats everyone the same, regardless of their bank account. Just the sheer complexity of these cases, the massive legal teams, the incredible amount of money it takes to fight a long federal trial, all of that can add to this perception.
Yeah, you see those teams of lawyers.
Exactly. Wealth absolutely allows you to get the best legal defense money can buy. Top-tier lawyers, often a whole team, who specialize in complex federal cases. It means you can fund your own extensive private investigations to find holes in the prosecution's case or dig up counter-evidence. It lets you hire expert witnesses for everything from financial analysis to psychological profiles. It allows the defense to file tons of pretrial motions trying to chip away at the case or get evidence thrown out. Wealth even allows for jury consultants to carefully analyze potential jurors and try to pick the most favorable ones. All these things cost a fortune and are just totally out of reach for most defendants.
Right.
So while it's not like a direct equation, money equals outcome, the perception that money can heavily influence your access to justice, the quality and sheer firepower of your defense, that's deeply rooted in how people see things, especially when verdicts seem surprising or when there seems to be a big gap between what was alleged and the final legal result. That sentiment reflects a much broader worry about fairness and equity in the justice system, whatever the specific facts of this particular case might be.
And we saw that division clearly in celebrity reactions, too. Really highlighted the emotional impact on different groups. You had 50 Cent on one side famously saying, "Did he beat the feds? That boy a bad man." What does that kind of reaction tell us about how power and the legal system are viewed in some circles?
Oh yeah, that 50 Cent reaction is very telling. It speaks volumes about a certain perspective, a certain worldview. It sees the legal system, especially the feds, a federal prosecution, as this massive, often hostile opponent. So from that viewpoint, managing to dodge the most serious charges against that kind of adversary, it's not just a legal win. It's seen as this huge show of power, cleverness, resilience. In some circles, maybe especially where people have dealt with tough legal or business fights, or maybe come from places where trust in government isn't exactly high, beating the feds is like the ultimate badge of honor, a sign of influence, proof you can withstand enormous pressure. It's less about the rights and wrongs of the accusations or what the alleged victims went through, and more about the outcome of the fight itself, a test of strength, of dominance. It can also carry a bit of cynicism towards the government's ability to actually bring down powerful people. It feeds that narrative that some foes are just too big, too well-resourced to really be held accountable by the system. That reaction often comes from a place of almost admiration for someone who can win against what feels like an overwhelming, maybe unfair system, no matter what the allegations were. It's just a different way of measuring success, survival, and defiance, maybe, instead of a traditional idea of justice.
But then, totally the opposite end of the spectrum, you have people like Aubrey O'Day, Rosie O'Donnell, reportedly disgusted, calling the verdict physically ill, really lamenting what it means for survivors. That's a completely different emotional, moral response.
It absolutely is, and their reaction really highlights the huge emotional and moral weight of this, especially for people who identify with or fight for survivors of alleged abuse. They're feeling disgusted, feeling physically ill. That comes from a place of deep empathy, concern about what this kind of mixed verdict signals to victims and to the whole movement for accountability in abuse cases. For them, this outcome isn't just about legal technicalities or prosecution strategy. It's fundamentally about justice, about validating the experiences of alleged victims, and about sending a clear message to perpetrators and survivors both. When the most serious, most public charges don't stick, it can feel like a massive failure of the system, a failure to protect victims, or a message that powerful people can somehow still sidestep full accountability. This perspective really underlines that gut-wrenching description of the verdict. For many, especially those deep in survivor advocacy, it just falls way short of what they see as real justice. It reflects this profound disappointment that the system, in their view, didn't fully deliver accountability for these kinds of allegations against someone so powerful. These totally opposite reactions, they perfectly show how polarizing this verdict is and the vastly different ways people are interpreting what it means legally and socially. It really drives home how one single legal outcome can be seen as a win by some and a total devastation by others, all depending on their values, their experiences, and what they're looking for from the justice system.
It's definitely clear this isn't over, not by a long shot. So let's shift focus a bit from what just happened to what happens next. What does all this mean for Diddy, for the case moving forward? What are the next steps, the potential long-term stuff?
Okay, so the first concrete, immediate step after these convictions is the sentencing phase. For those 2 Mann Act counts he was found guilty on. This doesn't happen overnight. It'll likely be in a few months. Usually there's a pre-sentencing investigation report that gets put together first. And like we mentioned, while the max penalty for each count is up to 10 years, experts are predicting that combined sentence range of 15 to 21 months, which, again, is significant time over a year in federal prison. It's a real consequence, even if it's nothing like the potential life sentences from the other charges.
Right.
So during sentencing, the judge will look carefully at several things. They'll review those federal sentencing guidelines, the range, based on the crime's severity and his criminal history. They'll also look at that pre-sentencing report from a probation officer. That report goes deep into his background, his conduct, anything that might lessen or increase the seriousness. And then both sides get to argue. The prosecution will likely push for a sentence towards the higher end of the guidelines, stressing the seriousness. The defense will argue for leniency, maybe pointing to the not guilty verdicts on the bigger charges or, Diddy's contributions outside this case. The judge has the final say within that guideline range, and their decision will reflect how they weigh all those factors.
Okay, and what about that hung jury on the big conspiracy charge? Does that just fade away, or is a retrial still a real possibility?
No, that unresolved racketeering conspiracy charge definitely does not just fade away. Prosecutors absolutely still have the option to retry him just on that count. And what's really interesting here is the complex calculation prosecutors have to make now. It's not a decision they'll take lightly. They'll look hard at several factors before deciding whether to go for round 2. Well, first, how strong did their original case seem, even with the hung jury? I mean, a hung jury means some jurors were probably leaning towards conviction, so they might feel they were close. They'll look at juror notes, any feedback, to see why they couldn't get unanimity. Second, is there any new evidence? Or could they reasonably expect to find some that might strengthen their case and convince a new jury? Third, did they make any strategic mistakes the first time? Maybe how they presented certain evidence or handled a witness, could they fix that? Fourth, they have to weigh the huge public pressure around this case, but also the significant cost money and manpower of running another full federal trial. It's a massive undertaking. And finally, just realistically, what are the odds of actually getting a conviction on a retrial given the challenges they already faced?
So it's a big decision for them.
Huge. And for Diddy, the prospect of a retrial means this whole legal fight just drags on. More uncertainty, potentially for months, even years. Legal costs keep piling up, and that massive cloud of the federal charges stays right over him. He can't definitively move on. Even if they don't announce a retrial right away, just the possibility means this chapter isn't fully closed. A big part of his future is still legally up in the air.
And separate from all the federal criminal stuff, his team immediately said they'll appeal the convictions, called the case flawed. Plus, we know there are still independent civil lawsuits moving forward, too. What do those other paths involve? How are they different from the criminal case we've been talking about?
Right. So an appeal is totally standard, completely expected, especially after a conviction in a case this big. When Diddy's lawyers call the case flawed, they're basically signaling they believe there were serious legal errors during the trial itself that might have affected the outcome. This could be anything from problems with how the judge instructed the jury on the law, to arguments about whether certain evidence should have been allowed in, or even claims of misconduct by the prosecution. An appeals court doesn't redo the trial. They review the record, the transcripts, the evidence, the judge's rulings to see if significant errors happen that mean the conviction should be overturned or maybe a whole new trial ordered. Appeals are complicated. They take a long time, months, often years, adding yet another layer to this whole ongoing legal saga.
Okay, in the civil suits, like Don Richards?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And understanding those ongoing civil lawsuits is crucial because it really shows the difference between criminal and civil law. The federal trial, that was criminal, brought by the government, the U.S., to decide if Diddy broke federal laws and should be punished by the state, usually with prison or fines. Civil lawsuits, though, are brought by private individuals or groups, the plaintiffs, like Dawn Richard in her suit. They're seeking money, damages, or other remedies for harm they claim they suffered.
And the standard of proof is different, right?
Totally different, and that's key. In a criminal trial, prosecutors have to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That's an extremely high bar. In a civil case, the plaintiff just needs to prove their case by a preponderance of the evidence. Basically, is it more likely than not, over 50% likely that what they're alleging actually happened?
Much lower bar.
Much lower. And it means it can be easier to win a civil judgment even if someone wasn't convicted criminally on related stuff. So these ongoing civil suits mean that even with this mixed criminal verdict, Diddy still faces major legal and financial risk. He could be ordered to pay huge amounts of money if found liable in these civil cases, totally separate from the criminal outcome. These cases move forward on their own track, often bringing out new allegations or evidence that keeps the public and legal spotlight firmly on Diddy and his past. It's a whole separate battlefield, but one with its own very serious potential consequences, both for his wallet and his reputation.
Wow. Okay, so if we zoom out again, look at the whole situation. This really isn't just about one famous guy, is it? It's about what this verdict actually means for the legal system, maybe for future cases like this. It does feel like it sets a pretty controversial precedent.
It absolutely does. This verdict is, like we said, rare. And for many, gut-wrenching feels like the right word, precisely because it pulls together two really powerful, almost conflicting outcomes that echo across the legal world and public thought. On one side, Diddy avoids those truly life-changing convictions, racketeering, sex trafficking, the ones that could have meant decades, maybe life in prison. That's undeniably a huge win for his defense, for him personally, spared the absolute worst. But at the same time, those convictions on the prostitution counts, they could still put him in prison for a significant time, likely over a year. So it's not like he walked away completely clear, but it's also not the full prosecution victory some expected or wanted. This split decision leaves this powerful sense of ambiguity that people will be picking apart for years. Yeah. And the practical impacts of that split, they're huge for everyone involved. For Diddy, it's relief from the worst, but definitely not total escape. Prison time and more legal fights are still real. For the alleged victims, maybe it feels like partial validation on some things, but deeply disappointing on the biggest allegations that could really affect their sense of justice, of closure, and for the public. It feeds that confusion we talked about. How can someone be not guilty of X but guilty of Y when they seem related? It really tests people's understanding, their faith in a system that often works on these fine distinctions. And this split verdict undeniably sets a new, controversial precedent for future high-profile abuse cases, especially involving powerful figures. Which brings up a really important question. What does this precedent signal? To prosecutors, to defense lawyers, to potential plaintiffs down the road?
What do you think?
Well, for prosecutors, it might signal they need to be even more precise with their charges. Maybe focus on narrower, more provable offenses if the evidence for those big conspiracy or coercion charges isn't absolutely rock solid. It could make them more cautious about overreaching with dramatic charges that are tough to prove. Maybe build cases on more concrete, even if less severe, allegations to secure some conviction rather than risking it all on maximal charges that might fail. A strategic shift, perhaps, for defense lawyers. It shows how vital it is to pick apart every single element of a charge, fight hard against those broader, more serious claims, even if some lesser charges seem harder to beat. It might encourage strategies focused on dismantling the enterprise or coercion parts of the case. And for potential plaintiffs, for victims, it could be discouraging, maybe suggesting that getting convictions on the most severe charges against powerful people is still incredibly difficult in criminal court. It might influence whether they push for criminal charges or maybe lean more heavily on civil suits where that burden of proof is lower. And the fact that this whole story is still unfolding, sentencing, possible retrials, those ongoing civil suits, just reminds us this chapter isn't closed. It's an ongoing legal drama, a social narrative that will keep shaping how we all understand justice, accountability, and the complexities of the law, especially when fame and money are in the mix.
What an incredibly detailed and, nuanced look at a really complex outcome. We've definitely covered those crucial legal distinctions that trip so many people up, the really varied, often opposing public reactions, and all the different ways this case could still play out over the next months, maybe even years. It really does underscore why it's so important to try and understand these detailed legal outcomes, rather than just grabbing onto the first, often simplified, headline you see. So what does this all mean for you, just trying to make sense of the world and how justice works, or sometimes doesn't seem to work within it?
I think this case, like a lot of these big legal dramas, it just shows us that justice isn't always simple. It's not always black and white. It's this complex thing, woven from precise legal words, really high standards for evidence, how a jury interprets things, and all that intense public focus. It kind of pushes us, as people trying to stay informed, to look past the initial shock, to try and understand the actual mechanics behind it all, to really grasp why an outcome might seem surprising, but maybe from a strictly legal view, make perfect sense.
Indeed. And this mixed verdict, it really does reveal the huge challenges in achieving what many people feel is justice today, especially with so much public scrutiny in these incredibly complicated legal frameworks. Is justice truly served when the result leaves so many people confused or frustrated or even disgusted, even while it delivers some legal accountability? Or is justice just seen differently by different groups, each with their own idea of what the right outcome should be? The Diddy verdict really pushes us to think about that justice can be this complicated, multifaceted, and often unsatisfying thing, especially when legal precision clashes head-on with strong public feelings. It's a reminder that every detail of the law matters, and that the story around a case can sometimes overshadow the specific facts and laws being applied. The ripple effects of this verdict, what it means for future high-profile cases, especially involving abuse and power, those will keep unfolding. And it just encourages all of us, I think, to stay critically curious about how our legal system actually handles these incredibly complex situations.